Could you give me a list of what you've been called too much of?
I have been called too intense, too chatty, too present, too absent, too stubborn, and too difficult.
Can you give us some examples or anecdotes of times you've been called these things?
I think I've been called too intense in relationships, mostly because the rhythms of my internal world are quite whirly in themselves, and so I change moods a lot, which brought about the part about me being called too difficult. Too stubborn, because ever since I was a child, it's been a character trait of mine, which unfortunately I can't always control, even though I realize I'm being too stubborn in certain situations. And I don't necessarily realize why, but I can't change it. So the first and earliest anecdote I can remember is when I couldn't open a door, and the door had a window pane. I was about 4 years old, and although I could have taken another way around to get out of my own house, I decided to put my fist through the door, and I still have the scar, because I was just too stubborn, and that sometimes just takes over. Too absent, because I have quite a rich internal world, and sometimes I just go into my own world, or I get too melancholy in states which I can never necessarily be able to control, and so that means that when people are present, I tend to drift off, and the only way I can get out of that state is not by snapping out of it, but by just living through it. I have also been called too controlling, but that's because being controlling has been a coping mechanism. I suffered from a quite intense anxiety disorder, which completely modified the way my brain works, although I did take medication, and so medication helped, and now I'm fine. I overcame the panic attacks and the anxiety attacks, which were quite intense. But my brain still works in such a way that I need to assess situations, and I always need to be very free and be able to walk out of somewhere, which sometimes means that I not necessarily walk out on people, but that they would have to follow, and that brings about an intense sense of, not necessarily of guilt on my part, but them guilt tripping me, because I need to always be very free with my choices, because beforehand it used to be a question of choosing between going out of a place or having to go into a state of panic, which is extremely harrowing. So that's sometimes a problem, but with people who've had issues, they completely understand. So I have been called too controlling because I didn't make anyone do that, but whenever I go to the cinema, because of the history I have, or the theater, I always choose seats on the aisle side of things, so I can get away easily if I have to. I've been in many situations where I've been in the middle, but I've been fine. But when I've had really bad experiences, those were extremely hard, and I never want to go back there. Too talkative. Thankfully, I chose a good profession to be too talkative, because I am a researcher and I'm a struggling academic at the moment. So it's a great skill I have now, being too chatty, because I can actually fill in the silences when my students can't be made to talk, no matter what I do. Sometimes they talk too much, so they take after me. I think that goes through the list, more or less.
Yeah, and with each of these different too muches, I mean, have you got any advice for other women who've been called too much of something? I mean, if they've been called too controlling, or if they are called too intense, or they're called too, I mean, you know, what's your advice for them? You know, and how has it actually been a power to you, or, you know, it can be a power that sort of can be used for negative, but also can be a very positive thing. It's an aura, maybe, rather than something that's just too, and you have to sort of cull it. I mean, if a young woman was worried, what would you
I think what's most important is also, of course, to be yourself, but there's not advice I would necessarily follow blindly, because it's something that gets thrown around a lot and there's no idea of nuance in it. If you call too much of something, perhaps repeatedly in different environments, it's a way of perhaps you assessing of how you situate yourself in a certain environment, or if that you being too much of something really impacts your daily life in a negative way, then you should maybe consider that it's not just them, that it's also maybe you. For me, it's been a really great technique of actually choosing my friends, and though I know that I am quite intense and chatty and perhaps even controlling, it's been a way of sifting for friends, because people who understand that without even it being brought up are some of my best friends. With people for whom this needs to be negotiated constantly, I tend to maybe shy away from sometimes, unless my bond to them is very intense in other ways. So I think being called too much of everything has been a great way of molding my own character and actually finding strength in who I am, rather than shying away from who I am. But I've always also adapted to certain situations.
Do you love them? Do you love those things about yourself? You've been called too stubborn. Do you love those things about yourself? I mean,
I love them until there are certain parts I can't actually control and they negatively impact my life. There's one thing that too muches have done for me, that at times they do make life too hard. Being stubborn is at times an obstacle, but because I know I'm very stubborn, I've also really learned to calibrate my behavior, and I can, in many situations where critical thinking, for instance, is at stake, can negotiate very well, and I can always perhaps try and see somebody else's side. If I'm called out on something, I don't necessarily think I'm right. And I understand that in certain situations I'm just not. And so it's been great to be self-aware of all of my too muches.
Do you think being called too stubborn could also be a way of, you know, talking about, if you're stubborn, you're quite passionate about certain things, and you have strong ideas about certain things, which, yeah, negotiation is great, and sort of, you know, having that string to your bow as well, but sort of it's the underlying power of it is not just stubbornness for the sake of being stubborn. It's sort of why is it that you are stubborn?
Sometimes being too stubborn has helped me a lot, particularly in my career with the creative choices I made, because I did stand my ground. I've also been, what was I called? My supervisor, I think, gave me a backhanded compliment and told me that I'm very confident and that she's not worried about me passing my Viva, because I was very good at defending myself, which in the end turned out to be great, because my creative choices were much applauded by other people. I think where I'm stubborn in my creative choices is that I would rather be wrong because I chose to do something a certain way, rather than me veering my course and saying yes to something I didn't necessarily want to do and then it being a mistake. I'd rather go with what I think is best, though I know for sure that there's a great chance that it might be a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to be fully responsible for the mistakes I make.
Yeah.
I think when women being told they're too much, they tend to renegotiate the way they feel about themselves. I think when a man is being called too much, he becomes more of what he's called as a reaction to it. In terms of taking space, of not taking up space, the problem with being a woman at times is that you're very conscious of it, and that your relationship to spatiality is extremely gendered, which is not something I'm very comfortable with in my day-to-day life. I'd like to take as much space as I want, or as little as I want, on the tube or on the street or in my own work, or when I'm speaking publicly. I don't think one should be told to be a strong woman or a weak woman or a vulnerable woman, or if there's a model for that. You should just be, if anything, just be too much of yourself rather than too much of what other people tell you are.
Describe your ideal world.
I can't describe my ideal world, but I think if I have a really envision a space for myself, it would be a large apartment with enough space for books, a lot of light, wonderful floors that I can lie on and sit on and be creative and use the entirety of the space rather than just being vertical all the time. Being able to be messy, and for me to take up as much space as I want in my mess, because I find it very creative. I like displacing things. There's always something around to be picked up. There's always a book. There's always a pen. There's always, makeup in a corner. My life looks very disordered, but there's a lot of order in what I do. I think that my space is always in between. It's always on its way of being messed up or on its way of being put aside. So I think I would like to just be able to take space in the way that my inner creative world looks, in a very spatial way, in a very visible way. I hope there's an alternate universe where I can walk around at night, where the weather's nice enough as well, not too nice, or it's just cool enough and dry enough for me to walk around at night, because I really love the cities when they're deserted in a way, and I just see little eruptions of life, and when I see fellow loners in the street, I quite like that. Just because, again, I think at night you can experience the architecture of a city and the space in very different ways than you can during the day, when a building doesn't have a function anymore, but is a building and is filled with emptiness, and you can look at that from the outside rather than thinking of it as a library or a bank or something that has a specific function.
Yeah. And if you could recommend a book that changed your life, or what book changed your life completely?
Oh, it was a photography book, actually. It's Roland Barthes' Camera Obscura that changed my life. I still work on death. I am a self-described death scholar. I dress as one for one. And it changed my life because of the relationship between photography in the past and photography in death, and how each photograph doesn't necessarily just represent the moment that something was very alive, but that it's something that will die in a moment that has died. So that has been the book that changed my life. It's my PhD topic, now continuing into my researching topic. I don't know how I should call myself once I've had my PhD, a postdoctoral project. So if there's any book I could recommend, that would be the one.
Okay, lovely. And is there anything else you'd like to say about being too much, or, you know?
I like to be too present.